Roberts.
And I'm Sue Hay, and in this episode we're looking at the issue of crime in our communities.
In his final public address in 1912, Salvation Army founder William Booth restated his long commitment to social justice. In this speech he said, "While men go to prison in and out, as they do now, I'll fight." How little has changed over these centuries since he gave this speech.
As we continue our pre-election series, we are going to look at what is wrong with New Zealand's criminal justice and prison systems, and at what we might do to stop men and women going to prison in and out.
New Zealand began an unfortunate social experiment in the early 2000s as both major political parties engaged in a bidding war to be the toughest on law and order. This bidding war was to some extent orchestrated by the law and order lobby, which called for tougher laws and longer prison terms in the name of sensible sentencing. The bidding war played out in our courts and prisons, as more and more mainly young men were sent to prison, and as our prison population grew by almost 50%. There is clear evidence that prisons don't work. They're costly to run, and many prisoners continue to reoffend on their release. Our TV screens and newspapers are full of stories of often quite horrific crimes, many of which appear quite random. These are sensationalised by in-depth accounts of gruesome details of murders and assaults, just so that media channels can build their audience numbers. But the more accurate story of crime is far less random or sensational. Indeed, most crime goes unreported or is not even recorded by police. The most recent survey of crime and safety in New Zealand showed that less than 1/3 of offences were reported to police. Of these, less than half were then actually recorded by police as offences. We can see from this that official crime statistics are really just the tip of an iceberg of offending and victimisation. Something else to realise is that this victimisation is highly selective. Over half of all offences appear to happen to just 6% of the population. The 6% of the population is mainly young, poor and Māori, similar in fact to the profile of many offenders. But it was not those most likely to be victims of crime who called for tougher laws and longer sentences. Rather, it was a middle New Zealand public, alarmed by the sensationalised media reports of particularly violent crime. And so it was to them that the bidding war of tougher laws and longer sentences was directed. In other words, our criminal justice policy has been driven more by public fear than by sound evidence of what might work in really reducing offending.
Because the crime issue is so complex, there is no one way of solving it, as some lobby groups would have us believe. The Salvation Army believes that as a country we need to address issues such as violence, youth offending and high rates of imprisonment across several fronts.
Firstly, we need to establish a more accurate picture of the perpetrators and, more important, who are the victims of violence. Once we understand that picture, resources such as police effort and the support of social agencies can be directed at both those who commit violence and the victims.
Secondly, we also need to look at ways in which we can stop youth offenders becoming serial offenders and perhaps even career criminals.
And thirdly, we need to make sure that prisoners have the support and opportunities they need to rehabilitate into the community once they leave prison. It's Not OK campaign has featured on our TV screens since 2007 and appeared to be quite successful in highlighting New Zealand's problems with family violence, and for a time in changing our response to that violence. Recently, the campaign appears to have gone a bit off the boil. Too little effort is being made by government, and there is no clear evidence that there has been any lasting behavioural change by those who are violent towards their families. As well, police responses to incidents of family violence appears patchy and not accurately reported, while funding for community-based violence prevention programs has certainly been reduced. I'm sure most Kiwis share the Salvation Army's view that this current state of affairs is just not okay, that we can and should be doing more to reduce violence, especially in our homes, and particularly towards women and children.
Each year, the Salvation Army helps close to 2,500 people struggling with their addiction to alcohol and/or other drugs. Many of these people come to our programs after having committed a crime. It is often the case that this offending has caused them to seek a way out of their addiction and destructive lifestyle. Around 1/4 of violent crime and 1/3 of property crime are connected somehow to the abuse of drugs and or alcohol. Most often, adult offenders start their criminal offending as teenagers. It would seem reasonable, therefore, to expect that much of the offending by teenagers has a similar link to drugs and or alcohol abuse. Yet despite these patterns, there are few programs available that support and redirect young offenders away from harmful drinking and drug use. Instead, people need to have offended repeatedly and even have been to prison before they can get help with their addictions. To us, this seems so unnecessary, and we believe that a more proactive approach needs to be taken where young offenders can gain early access to counselling and treatment for their drug and or alcohol addiction.
Of the 9,000 or so people who will be released from prison this year, around 4,000 will have committed another crime within 1 year of their release. More than 3,000 of these will return to prison within 2 years. These figures are frightening and consistent year in and year out. Such figures provide ample evidence that prisons don't work at reducing crime. Some would even suggest that prisons actually teach people crime, a sort of university of crime. Despite government's concerns about reoffending by released prisoners, nothing much has changed in terms of the support of ex-prisoners receive when they rehabilitate into the community. We might think rehabilitation and reintegration happen inside the prison, but the effective work of rehabilitation and reintegration usually happens in the community. Programs, of course, are needed in prison and should continue and look to address prisoners' problems with addictions, mental illness and illiteracy. But most importantly, released prisoners need greater levels of support when they get out, including support with their housing and employment. The Salvation Army believes greater political commitment is required to provide these services.
As the saying goes, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. If we are to seriously address the causes of criminal offending in New Zealand, then we as a country need to look more imaginatively at how we can change failing policies and approaches.
While law and order is unlikely to be the hot election topic of this election, there will be those who will challenge us to vote for the old solutions of longer and harsher sentences. Please follow William Booth's example and stand up for something better than such a grim solution.
Thank you for joining us in this election series, and be sure to make your vote count in this year's general election.